If you have ever opened the Bible to the book of Isaiah, you know it is massive. 66 chapters of soaring poetry, terrifying judgment, and breathtaking promises. It is often called the crown jewel of the Old Testament prophets. But behind the famous verses you hear in church lies a world of ancient political intrigue, shocking prophetic behaviour, and archaeological miracles that most people never talk about. Sure, you might know about the prophecies of the coming Messiah, but did you know Isaiah actually turned his own children into walking, breathing prophecies? Or that he spent 3 entire years doing something so scandalous it would probably get him arrested today? What about the ancient cave discovery that proved skeptics wrong, or the pagan king he boldly called the Messiah? Today we are breaking down 10 mind-blowing facts, historical secrets, and deep theological truths you probably didn't know about the book of Isaiah. From an incredibly gruesome martyrdom to a tiny, ancient word that completely amplifies the reality of the resurrection. This is going to change the way you read this prophetic masterpiece forever. Let's jump right into it. Let's start with number 1. Isaiah's children were literal, walking prophecies. When we name our kids today, we usually look for a name that sounds nice or maybe honours a grandparent. Not Isaiah. God commanded him to give his sons incredibly specific, prophetic names that carried heavy, unavoidable messages for the entire nation of Judah. His first son was named Shear-Jashub, which translates to, "A remnant shall return." This was a deeply bittersweet prophecy. On one hand, it was a stark warning that national disaster, destruction, and exile were absolutely coming. But on the other hand, it was a profound promise of hope. Through this boy's name, God was saying, "I will discipline my people, but I will not completely destroy them. A faithful few will survive and come back." But then there is his second son, who actually holds the record for the longest name in the entire Bible, Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz. Try saying that 3 times fast. It literally means quick to the plunder, swift to the spoil. This wasn't a message of distant hope. It was a blaring siren of imminent doom. It was a direct warning that the brutal, unstoppable Assyrian army was coming fast to conquer and pillage their northern enemies. Now think about everyday life in ancient Jerusalem. Imagine Isaiah simply calling his kids in for dinner. Every single time he shouted their names across the street, in the marketplace, or at the crowded city gates, he was preaching a sermon. He didn't just speak the prophecy, he made his own family a living, breathing billboard for God's word. His sons couldn't even introduce themselves to a stranger without forcing people to confront the very real judgment and mercy of God. Number 2, Isaiah walked naked and barefoot for 3 whole years. Yes, you heard that right. If you think the biblical prophets were just quiet guys sitting at wooden desks writing poetry, Isaiah chapter 20 completely shatters that image. Old Testament prophets were often asked to act out their messages in dramatic ways, but Isaiah took this to an entirely different, incredibly uncomfortable level. God commanded him to loose the sackcloth from his waist and take the sandals off his feet, walking around naked and barefoot. Now, historically and culturally speaking, this likely meant he was stripped down to a mere undergarment or loincloth. But in the ancient Middle Eastern culture of modesty, this was considered completely naked and deeply, horribly shameful. And he didn't just do this for a day as a quick stunt. He did it every day for 3 entire years. But why would God ask him to do this? It was the ultimate shocking object lesson. At the time, the nation of Judah was terrified of the brutally expanding Assyrian Empire. In their panic, they were trying to form a political and military alliance with Egypt and Cush to protect themselves, completely ignoring God's instruction. By walking through the streets of Jerusalem, looking exactly like a humiliated, defeated prisoner of war, Isaiah was literally turning his own body into a prophetic warning. He was showing Judah exactly what the Assyrian army was going to do to their so-called allies. Assyria was going to conquer Egypt and lead them away as captives, stripped, barefoot, and utterly shamed. Isaiah completely sacrificed his own personal dignity, enduring 3 years of intense public mockery, just to drive home one vital message. Do not put your faith in the military might of Egypt. If you tie your fate to them, their humiliation will become yours. Number 3, we need to talk about Isaiah's horrific, gruesome death. You might naturally assume that a prophet this incredibly important, a man who spoke directly to kings and accurately prophesied the coming Messiah, would get a peaceful end. But surprisingly, the Old Testament actually never records how Isaiah died. To find out what happened, we have to look at ancient Jewish tradition and an early apocryphal text called the Ascension of Isaiah. According to these historical traditions, Isaiah survived the reign of the righteous king Hezekiah, only to face his son, King Manasseh. Manasseh is widely considered the most evil and brutal king in the entire history of Judah. He rebuilt pagan altars, heavily practiced dark sorcery, and filled the streets of Jerusalem with innocent blood, turning the nation completely against God. Because Isaiah boldly refused to stop preaching the truth and openly condemn these terrible acts, Manasseh ordered him to be hunted down and executed. The ancient legend says that as Isaiah was fleeing from the king's ruthless soldiers, he found a large, hollow cedar tree and hid inside it. But the soldiers discovered his hiding spot. Instead of just pulling him out, King Manasseh gave a completely barbaric order. He commanded his men to take a heavy wooden saw and cut the tree in half right down the middle, literally sawing the great prophet in two while he was still alive inside. Now, you might think this is just a dramatic myth, but the New Testament actually seems to confirm it. If you read Hebrews chapter 11, often called the Hall of Faith, it lists the intense, agonizing sufferings of biblical heroes. In verse 37, it specifically states that some prophets were stoned, some were put to death by the sword, and some were sawn in two. For the original Jewish and early Christian audiences reading that letter, there was absolutely zero confusion. They knew exactly who that specific phrase was talking about, the ultimate martyr, Isaiah. Number 4 brings us to one of the greatest archaeological miracles of the 20th century, and it happened completely by accident. For centuries, skeptics argued that the incredibly accurate prophecies in Isaiah, especially the ones detailing the suffering and death of Jesus, must have been altered or added by Christians long after Jesus actually lived. They confidently argued this because the oldest known Hebrew copy of Isaiah in existence only dated back to around 900 AD. But in the spring of 1947, everything changed because of a wandering goat. A teenage Bedouin goat herder was searching the rugged, barren cliffs of the Judean desert near the Dead Sea. Looking for a stray from his flock, he casually tossed a rock into a small, dark cave opening up on the cliffside. But instead of hearing the bleat of a frightened goat, he heard the distinct sound of shattering pottery. Thinking he had just found hidden gold, he excitedly climbed inside. Instead of shiny treasure, he found ancient clay jars stuffed with dusty, decaying leather scrolls. What that shepherd boy stumbled upon became famously known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the absolute crown jewel of that entire discovery was the Great Isaiah Scroll. It was a massive, 24-foot-long document containing the entire, complete book of Isaiah. But here is the undeniable miracle. When scientists tested and dated this scroll, they found it was written around 125 BC, well over a century before Jesus was even born. When modern scholars nervously compared this ancient, pre-Christian scroll to the copies from 1,000 years later, they were stunned. The texts were basically identical, proving once and for all that the prophecies of Isaiah had never been tampered with. Number 5. Isaiah was the undisputed prophetic bestseller of the ancient world. When people talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, they usually focus on that one massive, perfectly intact scroll we just mentioned. But here is the secret that often gets left out of the conversation. Archaeologists didn't just find one copy of Isaiah hidden in those caves at Qumran. They found fragments and remnants of over 20 distinct copies. To truly put that into perspective, You have to remember how ancient publishing actually worked. There was no printing press or digital copying. Every single word had to be painstakingly written by hand, letter by letter, onto expensive animal skins. It took months of agonizing, meticulous labour by highly trained scribes just to produce a single manuscript. You do not make 20 copies of a book unless it is the absolute centre of your universe. Out of all the prophetic books in the Old Testament, Isaiah was by far the most popular and heavily studied text among the Qumran community. In fact, the only books they had more copies of were Psalms and Deuteronomy. Why did they obsess over it? Because this strict, isolated desert community deeply believed they were living in the final days of history. They were desperately waiting for God to suddenly intervene, and they viewed the book of Isaiah as their ultimate theological roadmap. They obsessively pored over its chapters, studying its vivid promises of a coming Messiah, the future restoration of Israel, and the apocalyptic defeat of evil. To them, Isaiah wasn't just a scroll, it was a living, breathing survival guide for the end of the world. This massive collection proves that long before Jesus walked the earth, ancient people were already waiting with bated breath for Isaiah's prophecies to come to life. Number 6. The massive academic debate over who actually wrote the book. If you take a modern college-level theology class today, you will almost certainly be taught that the book of Isaiah was not written by just one person. Many scholars argue there were actually 2 or even 3 different authors writing hundreds of years apart. Why do they think this? Because there is a monumental dramatic shift in the middle of the book. Chapters 1 through 39 are mostly filled with heavy warnings about the Assyrian Empire, written squarely during Isaiah's actual historical lifetime. But suddenly, in chapter 40, the tone completely flips. It jumps ahead over a century in time, offering deep comfort to Jewish exiles trapped in Babylon. Skeptical critics argue that a man living in the 8th century BC couldn't possibly know the exact details of the Babylonian exile, so some anonymous authors must have written the second half much later. But here is where the historical evidence gets fascinating. First, let's look at the ancient manuscripts. Remember the great Isaiah scroll from the Dead Sea caves. In ancient times, when a scroll contained multiple books by different authors, scribes would purposefully leave large blank spaces or start a completely new column to visually mark the change. But in the oldest surviving copy of Isaiah, chapter 39 ends and chapter 40 begins on the exact same line. There is absolutely no break, no gap, and no indication whatsoever that anyone in the ancient world thought this was written by multiple people. It was treated as one seamless, unified text. Second, look at the New Testament. Jesus and the apostles quoted from both halves of the book constantly, and they never split it up. In John chapter 12, the apostle John quotes from the first half of Isaiah and the second half of Isaiah in the exact same paragraph, attributing both of them directly to Isaiah the prophet. Ultimately, this debate comes down to one crucial question. Do you believe in supernatural prophecy? If God can actually reveal the distant future, there is no reason to doubt that the original Isaiah wrote the entire masterpiece. Number 7. The book of Isaiah is widely known by biblical scholars and theologians as the 5th Gospel. Now, wait a minute. How can an Old Testament book written over 700 years before Jesus was even born be called a gospel? The word gospel literally means good news, and it is traditionally reserved for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But Isaiah contains such an unbelievable amount of specific, vivid detail about the life, mission, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ that it reads much more like a first-hand eyewitness account than an ancient prophecy. Let's look at the raw data. The New Testament writers were absolutely obsessed with Isaiah. It is quoted directly or heavily alluded to over 400 times throughout the New Testament. To put that into perspective, when the apostles and the early church wanted to explain exactly who Jesus was to the world, their primary go-to source wasn't just their own memories, it was the book of Isaiah. Think about the most famous prophecies you hear around Christmas and Easter. The bold promise that a virgin would conceive and bear a son named Emmanuel. That is Isaiah chapter 7. The famous declaration, "For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God." That is Isaiah chapter 9. But the absolute pinnacle of this fifth gospel is the breathtaking poetry of Isaiah chapter 53. This chapter vividly describes the suffering servant. It graphically details an innocent man who would be despised, rejected, pierced for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquities. It explicitly states that by his wounds we are healed, and that he would be led completely, silently, like a lamb to the slaughter. If you handed Isaiah 53 to a skeptic who had never read the Bible and asked them who it was about, they would instantly say, Jesus of Nazareth. It is truly that precise. Jesus himself even launched his public ministry by unrolling the scroll of Isaiah, reading from chapter 61, and dropping the mic with, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." Number 8. Isaiah actually called a pagan, foreign king the Messiah. We just talked about how Isaiah perfectly described the coming of Jesus Christ, the ultimate Jewish Messiah. But in chapter 45, Isaiah does something that was absolutely scandalous to the ancient Jewish mind. He specifically names King Cyrus of Persia, a man who wouldn't even be born for another 150 years, and calls him God's anointed. Now, in the original Hebrew language, the word for anointed is Mashiach, which is where we get the word Messiah. King Cyrus is the only non-Israelite in the entire Bible to ever receive this deeply sacred title. Why is this so shocking? Because Cyrus was a pagan emperor who worshipped false gods. He didn't know Yahweh, and he certainly didn't follow the laws of Moses. Yet, God proudly declares through Isaiah, "I equip you, though you do not know me." God anointed Cyrus for one very specific monumental task, to completely conquer the supposedly unstoppable Babylonian Empire, legally free the captive Jewish people, and actually fund their return to Jerusalem to rebuild the destroyed temple. This is one of the most powerful theological statements in the entire Old Testament. It proves that God is not just some localized tribal deity of Israel. He is the sovereign Lord over all global human history. He holds the hearts of emperors in his hands, and he can use absolutely anyone, even a pagan, foreign dictator who doesn't even know his name, to accomplish his divine will and rescue his people. By giving Cyrus this title, Isaiah completely shatters the box that people tried to put God in, proving that God's plan of redemption is far bigger and much more unexpected than anyone could have ever imagined. Number 9. The book of Isaiah is actually the secret source code for the book of Revelation. When most people think about the end of the world, the apocalypse, and the stunning promises of an eternal paradise, they immediately turn to the very last book of the Bible. They imagine the Apostle John having these entirely unprecedented visions while exiled on the island of Patmos. But here is the fascinating truth. John was heavily pulling his imagery directly from the prophetic visions of Isaiah, written over 700 years earlier. Take one of the most famous, deeply comforting verses in the entire Bible. In Revelation chapter 21, John writes the beautiful promise that in eternity, God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. It is a gorgeous, iconic image, but John didn't invent it. He was actually quoting Isaiah chapter 25, where the ancient prophet boldly declared, "The sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces." What about the ultimate Christian hope of the new heavens and a new earth? That exact phrase is entirely original to Isaiah chapter 65. The breathtaking descriptions of the New Jerusalem, featuring gates made of precious stones and a glowing city that doesn't even need the sun or the moon because the glorious light of God illuminates it. All of those exact vivid details were first mapped out in Isaiah chapter 60. Isaiah didn't just predict the first coming of Jesus. He was the very first person to look all the way across the timeline of human history and clearly see the final, eternal restoration of the universe. This incredible connection proves that the Bible is not just a random, disjointed collection of ancient books. It is one brilliantly unified story, and Isaiah was given the absolute privilege of writing the grand finale centuries before the New Testament was even a thought. Number 10. A single tiny word discovered in the desert completely amplifies the greatest event in human history. Earlier we talked about Isaiah chapter 53, the famous suffering servant poem that perfectly describes the brutal crucifixion of Jesus. The chapter explicitly details how this innocent servant would be pierced, crushed, and ultimately killed, making his grave with the rich. But for centuries, the traditional Hebrew text for verse 11 felt just a little bit vague. It simply read, "Out of the anguish of his soul, he shall see and be satisfied." See what exactly? Many scholars assumed he was just seeing the general results of his suffering. Then came the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. When experts carefully unrolled the massive Great Isaiah scroll and examined chapter 53, verse 11, they found that a single, crucial word had been preserved from the most ancient text. The Hebrew word was or, which translates directly to light. So the ancient original text actually reads, "Out of the anguish of his soul, he shall see light and be satisfied." Why is this one little word so absolutely earth-shattering? Because in ancient biblical poetry, seeing the light is a direct, well-known idiom for possessing the spark of life. Think about the monumental impact of this. The servant in this chapter was just brutally executed and buried a few verses prior. He was dead. So if he is suddenly seeing light after the fatal agony of his soul, there is only one possible logical explanation. He came back to life. This isn't just a vague hint. It is a blazing, undeniable prophecy of the resurrection. Hundreds of years before the stone was rolled away from the empty tomb, that one tiny, ancient word proved that the Messiah's brutal death was not the end of the story. It was the glorious doorway to eternal life. So there you have it, 10 mind-blowing facts about the book of Isaiah that prove it is so much more than just a dusty collection of ancient poetry. From walking, breathing prophecies and agonizing martyrdoms to naming foreign kings and revealing the resurrected Messiah centuries before he even arrived, Isaiah is an absolute masterpiece of divine literature. It is not just an Old Testament history book, it is the glorious bridge that perfectly connects the entire story of the Bible. It reveals a God who is vastly powerful enough to orchestrate the rise and fall of global empires, yet deeply intimate enough to send a suffering servant to take our place. If you have always been intimidated by the sheer size and complexity of this book, I want to challenge you right now. Go open it up today. Read it with completely fresh eyes and a renewed mind. Look for the living history. Look for the staggering fulfillment of the fifth gospel. And most importantly, look for Jesus Christ shining on every single page. He is the glorious light that Isaiah saw, and he is the one making the new heavens and new earth a reality. Thank you so much for watching, and keep diving deep into the Word.